Let me ask this question. Now, before you answer the question, I need to preface the question. So I'm going to ask the question. Keep your hands down. Don't answer yet, because I want to help all of you out. Have you ever ran a race? Now, again, before you answer that question, I want to include as many of you as possible. Ready? So have you ever sauntered, strolled, walked briskly, or jogged a race of any distance? Raise your hand. Any distance. Yeah, see, I'm helping all of you. Because some of you would have read the word ran. You're like, I didn't run anything. I walked briskly. That works. And there's all different types of distances of races, 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, marathons. For me, I was about 30 pounds overweight, and I found myself sitting on the couch one day, and I had never ran any of these races, and I had this idea to run a race, and I chose a marathon for my very first race ever. Now, I grew up playing soccer, so I ran a lot, but I never ran a distance of any type. I mean, we'd run at practice, but that was different. I never ran track, right, any of that. And so I had this idea, and so I went to my wife. I said, hey, honey, I'm going to run a marathon, and she laughed at me. With me, not at me. It was at me. And she was like, you've never ran even a 5K or a 10K. I'm like, that's okay. It's 26.2 miles. I can do this. And I'll never forget the first time I ever went out on a run. I'd never ran a 1 mile, a 2 mile run. And the thought of 26.2 miles consecutively was a little overwhelming. I got done with my first 3 mile run. I'm like, I did 3 miles. I'm alive. And my next long run was like 5 miles. I'm still alive. I did 5 miles. And the first time I did a 10-mile run, I was like, I did 10 miles, like every long run. The first time I did 20 miles at one time, I was like, yeah, I'm still alive. One day, I came into my staff meeting, and my staff knew that I'd signed up, I had paid for this race. And I walked in at the beginning of the staff meeting, and I realized, well, let me preface something. It was my staff meeting when I was at a church in Vegas. Vegas is a key part of the story, because I walked in, and they were all literally with money betting on whether or not I would finish the marathon or not. And most of them were betting that I would not finish the marathon. I'm like, really? You guys don't think I can finish? And they were all like, no, Chris, we just don't think you're going to finish. I'm like, have some faith. So I went out, I ran, I finished the marathon. I was in pain, but I did it 26.2 miles. It wasn't my last one I ever ran. I ran many more of them. But there was something about that experience, right? Setting your mind to say, you know what, I'm going to accomplish something that no one else thinks I can do, and I'm not even sure I can do it as well. And what's interesting, when we think about the marathon is actually a pretty recent addition to the running kind of field. I mean, for thousands of years, people have been running in competition type of races, but the marathon is relatively new. It was the year 1896, where a guy named Pierre, who was a founder of the International Olympic Committee, he knew that the Olympics were coming to Athens in 1896, and so he wanted to do something. He wanted to do something in honor of the Olympics in Athens. So he came up with this idea of a long-distance run. It was right at 24.85 miles. That was the original distance, and he called it the marathon. And for Pierre, he was a student of history, and he wanted to tie the great history of Athens, Greece, and the Olympics to this sport. And so what he knew was that in 1490 BC was a great battle of Marathon, this epic battle where the Persians were crossing the seas with all their powerful army, and they were going to lay siege onto this great Greek empire. And so they came onto the beach there right next to the city of Marathon, and they had 20 to 25,000 infantry troops on the beach. Now, they had far more soldiers on ships coming in, going around the different parts of Greece, but they landed 20 to 25 soldiers on that beach, and the Greek army only had 10,000 troops strong, a 2-to-1 ratio. And with great wit, great determination, the Greek army won. And I'm not talking just barely beat the Persians. It was a landslide. By the time they were done fighting, 6,400 Persian soldiers dead. How many Greek soldiers? 192. That's all. They get done winning this epic battle, keeping the great Persian Empire at bay, meaning that it saved the Greek Empire. And one of the soldiers, his name was Phidippides, I think. You can pronounce it however you want. Phidippides got the charge to take the good news back to Athens. Because everyone in Athens and around the country, they were worried because they knew if they could not stop the Persian army would come in and just lay siege and kill everyone in their path. Could you imagine the tension? So for Phidippides, he ran all the way from Marathon to Athens, somewhere around 25 miles. And when we entered into Athens, he was screaming this Greek word. He was screaming, Niki, 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 Niki. It's this Greek word for victory. And now legend goes that after he got done screaming this Greek word, Niki, for victory, legend goes that he fell over and died. Most historians think that's not true, that he returned to the front lines. But when we think about this Greek word, Niki, that's the masculine version, but the root part of this Greek word is the feminine version of this word. And it's a very common word now. We say Nike, but in Greek, it's actually Nike. And this word, let's use English, Nike, is the same word for victory. It's just the feminine version. And Nike was a Greek goddess of victory. They would worship this Greek goddess both in competition and in war. Whenever they won a battle, they would celebrate and worship two gods, Artes, the god of war, and Nike, the goddess of victory. And for the Greek Empire and even the Roman Empire, they loved their competition, both in war and in sports competition. It's what connected these two empires together. That's why so many times people just talk about the Greco-Roman empires, right? Because their gods were similar. Like for the goddess of victory is this word Nike, and in the Roman side, the goddess of victory was Vicky or Victoria. So if you have some of these names, you know where your name has come from. And so they would worship this goddess of Nike to celebrate their battles won. Like I said, they loved their competition, and so the Greek Empire, somewhere around 786 BC, started gathering athletes together to compete together. And over the years, they developed what was called the Pan-Hellenic Games. And these are going to be very familiar to us because the Pan-Hellenic Games were they put on a 4-year cycle called the Olympiad. Sounds familiar, right? Year one, and this was the very beginning of their games, was a games called the Olympic Games. We call it the Olympics now, and they're on a 4-year cycle, right? And the Olympic Games were in honor of the great god Zeus, and they were held in the great city of Athens. Year 3 were the Pythian Games. They were in honor of the Greek god Apollos, and they was located in the historic city of Delphi. And maybe you've read about the Oracle of Delphi. That's the city. And so that was the Pythian Games. Then year 2 and 4 were 2 other games. The Nemean Games, and the Nemean Games were, again, in honor of the god Zeus, and the Isthmian Games in honor of the Greek god Poseidon. Now, what's interesting about the Isthmian Games, the word isthmus comes from the Greek word nik, and it has to do with this small strip of land where this ancient Greek city of Corinth is located. So when you think about the Isthmian Games, they were the Corinthian Games. That's where it was located. And when you look at the landscape from Corinth, where the Isthmian Games were, from Corinth to the Olympic Games, where Athens was about 50 miles, so that's quite a bit of distance. From Corinth to where the Pythian Games in Delphi was over 100 miles. But from Corinth to Nemean was only right around 20 miles or so. The Olympic Games and Nemean Games and Pythian Games all included the running sports. We'd call it track and field. But the Isthmian Games, well, they were different. They included horse racing because of Poseidon. They included combat games. And so the Isthmian Games, next to the Olympic Games, were second most popular. Olympic Games being number one. And all of this is so important for us to understand. Because as we bring this series, Victory, to a close, it's important to understand the backdrop because, well, the Apostle Paul was writing to the church located in the ancient city of Corinth. So Paul starts off and Paul writes this. He goes, don't you realize? Again, they were living in this culture. The Panhellenic Games were everything to this Greco-Roman world, everything. And so when Paul wrote, don't you know, they would have known everything he's going to write next. They realized. Paul didn't have to say, hey, by the way, don't you know about the Panhellenic Games and the Isthmian Games and the Nemean Games? He didn't have to refer to any of that. Why? They were living it. It's kind of like the area we live in. Right? Penn State football. It's just everywhere. I mean, they released the schedule, and on October 19th is a whiteout game, right? One of the most important games, which I just have to let you know, it's against my team, the Michigan Wolverines. Go Blue. Right? October 9th, it's Michigan State football. Pitt's traveling to Michigan for the 100th game that they've played against each other, right? Another one of those historic games in all of our towns. There's events. Like if you live in Ridgeway, you know about the Chainsaw Rendezvous, right? Paul wouldn't have to say, hey, in Ridgeway, you know that event about Chainsaw Rendezvous? You just know. All he would have to say is, hey, chainsaws, and you would think about that event. In Lock Haven, it's the regatta. You know about the regatta. In Clearfield, it's the Bloom and Berry Bash. Grampians Days. DuBois is, Community Days. Brockway is the old-fashioned 4th of July, right? These are events, and when you live around the area, we just know about them, right? And so Paul's writing to the church in Corinth. They understand the history around the Panhellenic Games. So when Paul says, don't you realize, he's saying, you know about this. I don't have to explain about all this. You get it because this is where you live. This has been going on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And he says, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets a prize. And they would all have understood this because the games were everything. The games were everything. He says, hey, don't you realize, like when you're in a race, everyone runs. But there's only one first place. Now, when I ran my marathon, I knew there was zero chance that I was going to get first place. I mean, it was just zero chance. I was just hoping, honestly, this was my goal. I just didn't want to be last. That was my goal. I'm like, if I'm not last, I will be so pleased with my results, and I want to cross the finish line. But he's talking to a culture where winning was everything. So Paul says, hey, run to win. If you're gonna race, if you're gonna go for it, 100%, all in. Give all yourself. Leave nothing on the field. Everything within you, you just lay it all out. He says, so run to win. And then he starts to break down how to run to win. He goes, hey, well, all athletes are disciplined in their training. Right? You can accomplish anything. I mean, I did literally from the couch to a marathon in 4 months. But I was disciplined. I started eating right. I started sleeping the hours I needed to sleep. I worked my training plan every day. When the Vegas winds were blowing 20, 25 miles an hour, I would go out and run. There was one marathon I trained for in New Jersey where it was so cold that winter, I did all my training on a treadmill. I did a 20-mile long run on a treadmill. Not fun at all, right? But you're disciplined. And Paul, again, talking to this audience that understood the top elite athletes in their area. He goes, hey, athletes are disciplined. What they eat, how they sleep, how they train, how disciplined they are, working their program. Like, they're disciplined in their training. He goes on, he goes, they do it to win a prize that will fade away. And this is something else that they would all understand, because you know what the prize was when you won one of the events of the Panhellenic Games? At the beginning, they would give out a pine branch crown. And then over the years, it changed to a celery leaf crown, and then they went back to a pine branch crown. So depending on, what period of time, there was either a pine branch crown or a celery leaf crown. And they would have all understood that. And so when Paul wrote, hey, they do it to win a prize that will fade away. It didn't take much imagination to know that, just a short amount of time, that pine branch crown, that celery leaf crown, right? It's just going to crumble, right? Bugs are going to eat it. It's going to dry up. It's going to shrivel up. They didn't have refrigerators back then, right? They couldn't freeze it, right? It's going to fade away. But we do it for an eternal prize. And Paul's just painting this powerful picture that in their culture, in their background, the Panhellenic Games, everything, but it's temporary. Even if you're lucky enough for them to build a statue of yourself because you were that great of an athlete, when Rome came in, Rome destroyed the city of Corinth, knocking over every statue possible. And they would have either have experienced that, a grandparent experienced that, would have known about that. Is these statues of famous people are now in trouble. Paul goes on and he goes, so I run with purpose in every step. Every step, there is purpose. And then he says something so cool, so cool. He goes, I'm not just shadow boxing. Now, 3 of the Panhellenic Games, the Olympics, the Pythian Games, and the Nemean Games, all included the running, track, and field sports. But not the Isthmian Games. The Isthmian Games added 2 different components. One was horse racing in honor of the god Poseidon. But they also added combat sports, which was different than the other 3. And that's why the Isthmian Games were so popular. They had Greek boxing, they had Greek wrestling, and they had this other type of Greek fighting competition. We call it UFC fighting, but it was like UFC on steroids. It was the ultimate fighting championship. The strongest person would prevail. They only had 2 rules. You want to know what the 2 rules were? The 2 things you couldn't do? 1, you couldn't gouge someone's eyes out. I think that's a good rule. The second rule, Mike Tyson would have a problem with it because you couldn't bite anyone, right? You could break bones, you could twist, you could do anything, right? Don't gouge eyes and don't bite people, right? Those are 2 rules. And you would either win by the person tapping out or you would kill the person. Didn't matter. Which you think is interesting. You can't bite the person, but you can kill them, right? I don't know, but that was their games. And the Isthmian Games were all about the combat sports. The other 3 didn't include them. And again, think about this. This is so cool. You're in Corinth. The Isthmian Games are everything to your city. And also, Paul says, I'm not just shadow boxing. I'm not just punching the air. And they would have all have watched some of the greatest combat fights ever. He says, run with purpose. Don't just hit the air. Don't just box by yourself. Remember, you're competing to win, and the finish line, not something that's going to fade away. It's eternity. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. And Paul's just talking about it. It's like I want to train myself. I want to train myself. So when I preach, and this will make more sense in a moment, when I preach, I don't want to do anything to disqualify what I'm teaching, what I'm telling people, what I'm sharing with people. And that's why the training thing is so important. So at this point, you have to ask 2 questions. Maybe you don't know it, but you have to ask 2 questions. What is Paul training for? Some of you have read just these words. They're great motivational words. I will run with purpose. I'm going to run to win. Maybe you've seen it on Instagram. Someone just put that snapshot. I'm going to run the race to win. But you got to ask the question, what is Paul training for? What is it? The second, what is Paul's purpose? Because he says, so I run with purpose. And here's what's important about studying the Bible. You got to take the whole thing in context. You just do. It's easy to take a verse, a word, a phrase, right, and just start anchoring thoughts around it. The more intentional way is to go, okay, what is the entire context around? And all you have to do in this section is read what Paul says right before this. Because Paul's going to tell us what he's training for. Paul's going to tell us what his purpose is. So right before this is what Paul writes. He goes, even though I am a free man with no master, I've become a slave to all people. Again, in this culture, slavery was a real deal. Now, it all changed with Jesus. Paul wrote to the church in Galatia. He goes, neither male nor female, Christian nor Jew, free nor slave, we're all one with Jesus. But he's still writing to a culture where slavery was everything. And he goes, I'm a free man with no master. I've become a slave to who? All people. In the Greek, do you know what the word all means? It's going to blow your mind. All. That's what it means. To bring who? Many to Christ. Purpose. What's Paul's purpose of running? To bring many to Christ. He goes on, he goes, when I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew, bringing the Jews to Christ. What's Paul's purpose? To bring all people to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under the law, even though I am not subject to the law. I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. Paul, who was a Jew, but now he's not. Why? He's a Christ follower. It was a new category. Before Jesus, that category did not exist. Jew, Gentile, male, female, slave, free, all these categories. With Jesus, one category, just one category. Women, I'm just letting you know, you had no value in the world at that point until Jesus. Until Jesus. Paul, who was raised in a house, in a culture that devalued women, is now saying, no. Male, female, same value. Jesus values all people. It was a game changer. For people who were sold into slavery, now we're hearing about Jesus, that they were the same value as every other person. Game change. And Paul's like, hey, grew up as a Jew, but I want to reach all Jews for Jesus, so I'm okay with coming back underneath the Jewish law. All 613 laws, what to eat, what not to eat. I'm going to do that when I'm with the Jews. Why? All people matter to Jesus. But Paul doesn't stop there. He goes, for the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law. So I can, purpose, bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. And this is kind of a complicated statement with so much power to it. So Paul's like, if I'm with Jews, I'm going to do what the Jews do. When I'm with the Gentiles, I'm going to do what the Gentiles do. And I'm going to bounce back and forth because I want to reach all people for Jesus. And he goes, I don't ignore the law of God. So he's looking at it, just like we should look at God's law. But he goes, but I obey the law of Christ. And what's the law of Christ? To love each other. All other laws attached to how we treat each other, how we love each other. Tri-County, we just talk about we want to love like Jesus loved. That's the love first. In every interaction, even when we don't want to, even when someone has wronged us, even when someone has talked about us, even when someone has gossiped about us, even when someone doesn't want to even engage with us, right? Whatever the scenario, we just love first. Let's love first. So easy to say, so difficult to live out. We want to love like Jesus loved. We want to live differently. We want to live like Jesus lived. So we're going to watch how Jesus interacted with everyone. And let's just model that. Let's model that. We want to lead like Jesus led. We want to lead passionately with the one life we have. And we want to leave behind what Jesus left behind, which was a legacy of people. A legacy of people who loved, lived, and led like Jesus loved, lived, and led. Paul's like, I'm not ignoring all of this Jewish law, the law of God, but I'm obeying, I'm following Jesus. And then he says, when I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Purpose. I mean, Paul wants to paint this picture of all people. And then Paul writes something that might be a little shocking to some of you. Maybe not. But what he writes next, he's like, I'm trying to find common ground with everyone. Do you know in the Greek language what the word everyone means? Blow your mind. It means everyone. Doing everything. Do you want to know what the word in the Greek language means for everything? It means everything. And you see, think about this. This is so cool. You see time and time again, Paul searching for common ground, doing everything he can, everything, to reach all people. It's why he looks at these Isthmian games to celebrate the god of Poseidon, and he goes, don't you know? They're like, yeah, we know. They've been going on since 700 or so BC. Don't you know? Common ground. I want to run a race like the Olympics, like the Pythian Games, like the Nemean Games. I want to run a race. You know those disciplined athletes? Do you know in the Greco-Roman Empire that most athletes barely wore any clothing, and a lot of them went naked? Why? To show off their physiques. Some of them would take olive oil and cover their entire body with olive oil to accentuate their trained physiques. They were the elite of the elite, the best athletes in the world. When Paul writes, he says, don't you know? It's common ground. Common ground. Why? Purpose. Doing everything I can to save some. Paul realized he wasn't going to save everyone. Not everyone was going to come to Jesus. But he could do something to save some. And then I do everything to spread the good news. What's the good news? Jesus came. He was crucified. He was buried. God raised him. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people saw Jesus alive. Saw Jesus alive. If you're a Christ follower, if you know Jesus, if Jesus is the subject of your life, run to win. Run to win. And run with purpose in every step. Look for the common ground. Look for the common ground. The places where people who don't know Jesus are at. Maybe you were raised in a house where it's like, well, all of a sudden your family, they named Jesus subject of your life, and all of a sudden they became isolated from the world. Maybe you were raised in a house where it's like, oh, we can't be part of the world. We can't be part of the world. Why was Paul training? Why was he disciplining himself? Because he was going to go find common ground. He was going to go into these cities, into these common ground places where people who don't know Jesus were. He realized he was stepping into their messy world. And he's like, I'm going to go there. Why? Because I'm going to do everything short of sin, so that some may know Jesus. Christ followers, we're not called to live isolated lives. We're called to live disciplined lives, so when we go and we step into people's lives, when we find common ground, when we're willing to do everything and anything, again, short of sin, to reach all people for Jesus. It's our purpose. That's not my purpose. Chris Trethewey, the pastor, take that hat off. Chris Trethewey, the Christ follower, it's my purpose. If you ever wonder why we do what we do at Tri-County Church, I just want you got to come back to Paul's words, because we take those words seriously. We're always, always, always looking for common ground. And we are willing to do anything and everything to create bridges, to create connection points, to reach as many people as we can for Jesus. It's not why we do what we do as a church, as Tri-County Church. It's why we do what we do as Christ followers through Tri-County Church. So next week, we're going to be launching, it's kind of like part 2 of Victory. It's like the sequel to Victory. It's a better sequel. Have you ever watched the second movie of a series and you're like, that was worse? No, this is better. And we're simply titling it Love First, looking beyond ourselves. Because ultimately, to love first means that we're other people focused. Love first means that I care less about myself. I care a whole lot more about other people. Loving first means my comfortability is less important than other people. Loving first means I'm willing to find that common ground. Loving first means I'm willing to do anything and everything. Loving first means I know what my eternity is. And now, because of that, I know what my purpose is. And my purpose is all about people who don't know who Jesus is. Love first is all about looking beyond ourselves. We kicked off this entire series, Victory, on Easter weekend. And we looked at a section in this letter to the church of the ancient city of Corinth, the home of the Isthmian Games. And right towards the end of the letter, Paul writes these words: "But thank God, he gives us victory over sin and death through our Lord Jesus Christ. So my dear brothers and sisters, be strong and immovable." When Jesus is our foundation, nothing can move us. And when Jesus is our foundation, listen, don't miss this. Our purpose is all about people who don't know Jesus.